impeachment of President Trump. Let's go right to Capitol Hill right now, where the House Speaker is expected in just moments to formally unveil articles of impeachment against President Trump. You see there the committee chairman charged with this investigation, and the Speaker of the House now comes to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. On this solemn day, I recall that the first order of business for members of Congress is the solemn act to take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. There's great respect and gratitude that I thank the chairs of the committees, the 6 committees who have been working to help us honor our oath of office. I also want to thank the staff of those committees and the committee members for all of their work over this period of time to help us protect and defend. I want to thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler, chair of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Schiff, chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Chairman, all of these chairmen, Chairman Richie Neal of Massachusetts, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Elliot Engel of New York, the chair of the Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters of California, the chair of the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. I also want to acknowledge the important work that was done by our dear and departed, may rest in peace, Elijah Cummings as chair of the Oversight Committee. Now pleased to yield to the distinguished chair of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Over the last several months, the investigative committees of the House have been engaged in an impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump's efforts to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 elections, efforts that compromised our national security and threatened the integrity of our elections. Throughout this inquiry, he has attempted to conceal the evidence from Congress and from the American people. Our president holds the ultimate public trust. When he betrays that trust and puts himself before country, he endangers the Constitution, he endangers our democracy, and he endangers our national security. The framers of the Constitution prescribed a clear remedy for presidents who so violate their oath of office. That is the power of impeachment. Today, in service to our duty to the Constitution and to our country, the House Committee on the Judiciary is introducing 2 articles of impeachment charging the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, with committing high crimes and misdemeanors. The first article is for abuse of power. It is an impeachable offense for the President to exercise the powers of his public office to obtain an improper personal benefit while ignoring or injuring the national interest. That is exactly what President Trump did when he solicited and pressured Ukraine to interfere in our 2020 presidential election, thus damaging our national security, undermining the integrity of the next election, and violating his oath to the American people. These actions, moreover, are consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in our 2016 presidential election. And when he was caught, when the House investigated and opened an impeachment inquiry, President Trump engaged in unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of the impeachment inquiry. This gives rise to the second article of impeachment for obstruction of Congress. Here, too, we see a familiar pattern in President Trump's misconduct. A president who declares himself above accountability, above the American people, and above Congress's power of impeachment, which is meant to protect against threats to our democratic institutions, is a president who sees himself as above the law. We must be clear. No one, not even the president, is above the law. I want to recognize the great contributions of the investigative chairs, particularly Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, Foreign Affairs Chairman Eliot Engel, Committee on Oversight and Reform's former chairman, the late Elijah Cummings, and its new chairwoman, Carolyn Maloney, Financial Services Chairwoman Maxine Waters, and Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal, who helped lay the foundation for the articles we are introducing today. I also want to thank my Judiciary Committee colleagues who were critical in our work to hold the President accountable and in the drafting of these articles. Later this week, the Judiciary Committee will meet to consider these articles of impeachment and to make a recommendation to the full House of Representatives. We do not take this action lightly, but we have taken an oath to defend the Constitution. And unlike President Trump, we understand that our duty, first and foremost, is to protect the Constitution and to protect the interests of the American people. That is why we must take this solemn step today. Elections are the cornerstone of democracy and are foundational to the rule of law. But the integrity of our next election is at risk from a president who has already sought foreign interference in the 2016 and 2020 elections and who consistently puts himself above country. That is why we must act now. I want to turn now to Chairman Schiff, who will explain the evidence that supports these articles and the need for us to act with such urgency today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and to my colleagues. Good morning. The framers of the Constitution recognized that someday a president might come to office who would abuse that office, betray the public trust, and undermine national security to secure foreign help in his reelection, and who would seek to abrogate the power of Congress to hold him accountable. They recognized this danger, and they prescribed a remedy, and that remedy is impeachment. It is an extraordinary remedy and one that I've been reluctant to recommend until the actions of President Trump gave Congress no alternative. We stand here today because the president's continuing abuse of his power has left us no choice. To do nothing would make ourselves complicit in the president's abuse of his high office, the public trust, and our national security. The president's misconduct is as simple and as terrible as this. President Trump solicited a foreign nation, Ukraine, to publicly announce investigations into his opponent and a baseless conspiracy theory promoted by Russia to help his reelection campaign. President Trump abused the power of his office by conditioning two official acts to get Ukraine to help his reelection: the release of hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid that nation desperately needed, and a White House meeting with an ally trying to fend off Russian aggression. In so doing, he undermined our national security and jeopardized the integrity of our next election. And he does so still. The evidence of the president's misconduct is overwhelming and uncontested. And how could it not be when the president's own words on July 25th, "I would like you to do us a favor, though," lays so bare his intentions, his willingness to sacrifice the national security for his own personal interests. And when the president got caught, he committed his second impeachable act: obstruction of Congress of the very ability to make sure that no one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. The evidence is every bit as strong that President Trump has obstructed Congress fully, without precedent, and without basis in law. If allowed to stand, it would decimate Congress's ability to conduct oversight of this president or any other in the future, leaving this president and those who follow to be free to be as corrupt, malfeasant, or incompetent as they would like, with no prospect of discovery or accountability. Now, some would argue, why don't you just wait? Why don't you just wait until you get these witnesses the White House refuses to produce? Why don't you just wait until you get the documents the White House refuses to turn over? And people should understand what that argument really means. It has taken us 8 months to get a lower court ruling that Don McGahn has no absolute right to defy Congress. 8 months for one court decision. If it takes us another 8 months to get a second court or maybe a Supreme Court decision, people need to understand that is not the end of the process. It comes back to us and we ask questions because he no longer has absolute immunity, and then he claims something else, that his answers are privileged and we have to go back to court for another 8 or 16 months. The argument, why don't you just wait, amounts to this. Why don't you just let him cheat in one more election? Why not let him cheat just one more time? Why not let him have foreign help just one more time? That is what that argument amounts to. The president's misconduct goes to the heart of whether we can conduct a free and fair election in 2020. It is bad enough for a candidate to invite foreign interference in our political process, but it is far more corrosive for a president to do so and to abuse his power to make it so. Despite everything we have uncovered, the president's misconduct continues to this day, unapologetically and right now. As we saw when he stood on the White House lawn and he was asked, what did you want in that July 25th call? And he said the answer was a simple one. And not just a simple one on July 25th, but a simple one today, and that is he still wants Ukraine to interfere in our election to help his campaign. Even this week, the president's lawyer was back in Ukraine seeking to revive the same debunked conspiracy theory promoted at the president's behest. Which gets to the final and most pernicious of the arguments that we have heard in the president's defense. That the president can do whatever he wants under Article 2, including get foreigners involved in our elections, and we should just, to quote the president's chief of staff, get over it. Ben Franklin said, we have a republic if we can keep it. The president and his men say, you can't keep it, and Americans should just get over it. Americans don't get to decide American elections anymore. Not by themselves, not without foreign help. For the members of Congress, this is not a question of fact because the facts are not seriously contested. It is rather a question of duty. The president's oath of office appears to mean very little to him, but the articles put forward today will give us a chance to show that we will defend the Constitution and that our oath means something to us. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It appears the members will not take questions. There you have it. The drive to impeachment full speed ahead right now. Democrats, led by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, saying the evidence is overwhelming and uncontested, have now unveiled 2 formal articles of impeachment against President Trump, both connected to his efforts, they say, to pressure Ukraine to open investigations into Joe Biden and the Democrats and then prevent Congress from looking into it. I want to go to our chief White House correspondent, John Karl, in Washington right now. The day President Trump has rued for a long time.
It's certainly something he wanted to avoid. It's also something that he knew was coming, increasingly obvious in recent weeks. And before this press conference, he tweeted his response because he knew this was coming this morning. Take a look at this, George, the president, and this is the line we will hear from them for a long, long time. To impeach a president who has proven through results, including producing perhaps the strongest economy in our country's history, to have one of the most successful presidencies ever, and most importantly, who has done nothing wrong, is sheer political madness. So the president will portray this as a political act, as a biased act by Democrats. And the point right now, as you saw right there, those were Democrats announcing those articles of impeachment, and as of right now, only Democrats publicly supporting them.
Led by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she was reluctant to pursue impeachment during the Mueller investigation and after the Mueller report, but in the wake of the reports on this Ukraine phone call, she did come forward. And Terry Moran, who's up there on Capitol Hill, was inside the Rayburn room. Nancy Pelosi didn't say much this morning, but no question she wanted to be there to show that she is driving and in charge of this process.
In charge of the process and the tone of the process. She wants this to be not typical partisan politics. She knows the Democrats, some members, have been eager to impeach this president from the moment he got into office. One of the challenges for Democrats is to persuade people this is the real deal. This time it's different. And one of the ways you can tell, she is insistent that it is a solemn process, that it is constitutional, and that it is a duty that Democrats are doing, not a weapon in their partisan war. So they lay out the rationale, they lay out the evidence, and they make the case constitutionally. As I say, I think they do have a bit of a problem, but she now is in control of this process, its pace, which is lickety-split, and its tone, which is solemn and serious.
Lickety-split, one word for it. This is a fast process, although the number of days they've considered impeachment now longer than the number of days devoted to Bill Clinton's impeachment after the submission of the Starr report back in 1998. But David Muir, World News anchor, Adam Schiff, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, did directly address that question of why they were going so fast. It's to protect the next election.
It's exactly what he said, and this has been the central argument. We heard it all day yesterday in those 9 hours of contentious hearings, Republicans making their final case before this was to happen, along with Democrats as well. But the Republican argument has been a fast track of impeachment, even though you point out the Clinton impeachment was fewer days than what we've seen so far. And you heard Adam Schiff there say just a moment ago, the central argument from Republicans has been, why not just wait until you get the witnesses that you want from the White House? He tried to draw a parallel to Don McGahn waiting 8 months, though we know they probably could speed that up in an impeachment inquiry. But he said, if we wait several more months for these witnesses, for these documents, then essentially the argument amounts to, why don't you let him cheat in one more election?
And they pointed to Rudy Giuliani being in Ukraine just this last week. Let's bring in our legal team as well. Melissa Murray, professor of constitutional law at NYU. And Terry Moran mentioned it. We saw the speaker, first sentence out of her mouth, go straight to the Constitution. The Democrats want to explain to the American people now, this is what the founders envisioned when they were talking about impeachable offenses.
I mean, she was the proponent of originalism this morning. This is exactly what the framers contemplated. Adam Schiff reiterated that. The framers contemplated the idea that there would be a president at some point in history whose ambitions would exceed the oath of office and would go beyond what the oath of office required. And there had to be a congressional remedy to check that. And that remedy was impeachment. This is not political. This is not a witch hunt. This is their solemn duty.
And Dan Abrams, this is the distilled case we saw from the Democrats, down to 2 articles of impeachment. I think there were 3 articles against Richard Nixon, 4 for Bill Clinton.
I think they're trying to make them as sort of understandable as possible based on the facts as we know them, right? Which is, once you get into something like bribery, for example, you get into a debate about the constitutional version versus the current federal statute, et cetera. This is simple and easy to understand. The Democrats are saying he abused his power. He's trying to cheat. He's trying to win the next election by cheating. That's an abuse of power. And you know what else he did, they say? He obstructed Congress's effort to investigate once he got caught. It's a kind of easy-to-understand narrative. And I think that's the route they've gone, rather than going broader, rather than adding other articles. But it'll be interesting to see how detailed, for example, abuse of power gets or obstruction of Congress gets. Are they going to lay out evidence that happened in the Mueller investigation, even though it's not a specific article in and of itself?
And Terry Moran, one of the ways they seem that perhaps are open to at least shoehorning some of the facts from the Mueller investigation into these articles, they talk about a pattern of conduct from the president, a familiar pattern.
Precisely. What they, what they want in these impeachment articles is to, demonstrate not just the Ukraine controversy and scandal is worthy of impeachment, but that it echoes, as you say, the way he has governed since then. One of the problems they have on that second article of impeachment, though, obstruction of Congress, they're essentially saying that if the president goes to court to defend the presidential prerogative of privilege over his closest advisors, that amounts to obstruction of Congress. That's a trickier argument.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that because I noticed that I think it was Jerry Nadler, and let me bring this to the legal team, added a word when he was describing the obstruction. He used indiscriminate. And I think that was the point he was trying to address, the point that Terry was making. Yeah, presidents go to courts all the time, but you just do it in a blanket way. That's where you see the violation.
I think the whole idea here is this sort of embiggening of Article 2, that the president doesn't have to do anything that the president doesn't want, and that leads to a kind of indiscriminate determination that no officials in the White House can actually be brought to testify before Congress. And that's very different than what we've seen in other impeachment situations.
And we also saw, Dan Abrams, the point that Adam Schiff was making there, that if they let this stand, this kind of blanket refusal to work with Congress, that would decimate the ability of Congress to conduct oversight in the future.
Right. But I think that when you look at what happened here, for example, he compared it to the Don McGahn case, which did take 8 months to just get a district court ruling. And there the question was, does Don McGahn have immunity? And that didn't even address the question of, okay, now that he doesn't have immunity, what privileges might he try and now invoke? So he's got a fair argument that that has taken a long time. On the flip side of it, in an impeachment proceeding, as David pointed out, you could expedite it. You could certainly get an expedited ruling.
That happened in the Nixon case.
Correct. The problem is it would still be two levels. It would first be the argument that he's basically saying, the president thus far, no one can testify. And as a result, you first have to address the question of full immunity. And you resolve that in the courts, then they have to show up. They show up and they invoke privilege. And you have to go then back to the courts to determine what would be privileged and what wouldn't be privileged. So it is fair to say that even expedited, it would still take a while.
Cecilia Vega, the White House knows what's going to happen in the House. They're looking ahead to the Senate.
Yeah, George, that is where they are hoping they can get a fair trial in the chamber that is controlled by their party. The president has said that he would like to see his top officials there testify. He has floated the idea of himself testifying out. No one really thinks that that is actually going to happen. But, you know, we are now one step closer to President Trump becoming the third president in American history to have this impeachment stain on his legacy. And while he told me publicly just the other day that he is not worried about this being on his legacy, George, we know privately he is very much concerned about this going forward.
And it could come as soon as next week. Thank you all very much. We're going to return now to our regular programming. For many of you, that is Good Morning America. Have a good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.